Hi there, and welcome back to this discussion of UBI. In this lecture, we'll talk about the economic foundations of universal basic income. Let's do it. What is capitalism? Well, let's start from the beginning. Around the 18th century, we saw the decline of feudalism and the rise of early capitalism in the Industrial Revolution. If you want to learn about early capitalism in Europe, you could read works like Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, where he essentially extols the virtues of the division of labor in the production of goods. Another economic liberal was David Ricardo, who made some good groundbreaking observations on wage labor, profit, and international trade. But ironically, I would argue that Karl Marx, a vehement opponent of capitalism, gives a reasonably good overview of the contradictions of capitalist markets, even though he was wildly wrong, obviously, about what should replace capitalism, in my view, at least. Karl Marx argued that there is something intrinsically unstable about capitalism, and that left to its own devices, it creates its own negation. Alternatively stated, Marx thought that capitalism was self-destructive. What do you mean when you say that capitalism is self-destructive? Well, Marx thought that capitalist economies were inherently unstable because the act of production involves exploitation of what he called the labor power of workers. Because capitalists are the owners of the means of production, they're able to squeeze profit from employees. He expanded his ideas about capitalism in his classic work, Das Kapital. But whereas Marx focused on the point of production as the source of instability within a capitalist economic system, a post-Marxist economist, Rosa Luxemburg, instead focused on consumption as the source of instability. Rosa Luxemburg drew on Marx's ideas and set out her own theory about why capitalism was doomed to fail. In short, she argued that capitalist production leads to what she calls a crisis of underconsumption. Okay, but what's a crisis of underconsumption? Good question. The best way to explain this economic theory is like this. So, capitalism creates increasing relative inequality between the rich and the poor. Although everyone's absolute standard of living has gone up because of capitalism and capitalist innovations, wealth becomes, over time, increasingly concentrated in the hands of a very few rich people and corporations. You've probably heard the term the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Well, the crisis of underconsumption is based on the fact that over time, in an unregulated laissez-faire market, according to Marx, wealth gets concentrated in the hands of the few. As a result, the vast majority of society that depend on wages to live see an erosion of their purchasing power, over time that is. They aren't getting enough of the economic growth pie, so to speak, and so they're left with diminishing purchasing power. This means that employees' wages are too low for them even to buy or consume the goods and services that they produce. This is what I mean by a crisis of underconsumption. If capitalism is so unstable, then why does capitalism dominate in the world's economies? All right, another good question. So according to the crisis of underconsumption, only unregulated laissez-faire capitalism is unstable. A completely free market, say with no government intervention, does indeed tend towards its own destruction because it takes the money out of the hands of the working people and places it in the hands of the already wealthy. Again, this is a sort of Marxist assumption. But this does not mean that capitalism should be abandoned for socialism, as Marx has argued. Instead, what has happened is that capitalism was reformed, so to speak. The earliest reforms to capitalism were set out by Kautsky in the early 20th century. Later, people like John Maynard Keynes, a Cambridge economist, took up the torch and argued that capitalism is still the best way of organizing the economy, but that we need to have governmental or state intervention to essentially save capitalism from its self-destructive tendencies. Keynesianism is arguably the dominant economic paradigm of today. As the former US President Richard Nixon once said, "We are all Keynesians now." I still don't know what you mean by Keynesianism. Can you tell me more? Sure, no problem. As I said, John Maynard Keynes was an economist who favored what are often referred to as demand-side solutions to economic problems. Keynes came along and said that the classical liberal economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo were flat out wrong, right? Instead of the government sitting back and letting the invisible hand of the market do its magic, Keynes argued instead that the government, the state, needed to intervene when capitalism was on a downswing. He is in many ways responsible for the modern welfare state. He argued that wealth had to be transferred from the rich to the poor in order for capitalism to, work its magic. So if an unregulated economy naturally leads to a concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, then a strong state was needed, according to Keynes, to tax the wealthy and redistribute that money to those at the bottom of the pyramid. By redistributing wealth, the state could then increase consumer demand by putting money in the hands of the many, where it will be spent, resulting in, according to Keynes again, further economic growth. Okay, I'm starting to get it, but what does all this have to do with UBI? Well, Keynes himself never proposed a universal basic income. In this sense, the idea of universal payments from the state to every citizen is a post-Keynesian idea. But you can see the similarity between demand-side economics and UBI. Both are essentially responses to the tendency on the part of unregulated capitalism to concentrate wealth in the hands of the few. Proponents of UBI argue that such wealth redistribution is not only morally correct, but it's also good for economic growth. Whether they're right or wrong about this is an empirical question, I think, that has yet to be answered. But the fact remains that UBI payments will increase consumer demand by making sure that every single citizen, or at least permanent resident of a country, has some money to spend, which is obviously better than no money to spend at all. So as long as everyone has some money to spend, transactions will increase opportunities for employment, especially in retail and housing. On the other hand, will people still want to work if they're getting quote unquote free money from the state? And I think that's the million-dollar question that we need to answer. Do economists say that UBI is inevitable? Well, some do and some don't. Virtually every economist agrees that the labor market is getting more difficult for employees, many of whom are working in part-time or insecure gig jobs. And I would point out that that's especially true for young people. Technological advances are eroding job opportunities as automation of tasks becomes more common in production. When work disappears, there are two potential outcomes. First, the unemployed can become long-term unemployed. There just aren't enough jobs out there to absorb the numbers of young adults entering into the labor market, for instance. And secondly, new jobs will be created and the unemployed will retrain and move into those new jobs. So far, the second outcome has proven to be, I think, more likely. When manufacturing left the West for the East, everyone was talking about the end of work at that time, but instead work just simply shifted towards something else, primarily the service sector. But will the same be true over the next few decades? Well, no one really knows. The evidence does show that there are fewer high-wage jobs these days, which puts more pressure on the government, I think, to implement a UBI program. What about you, Professor Timming? Where do you stand on this debate? Well, frankly, it doesn't really matter where I stand on it. What matters is where you stand. So ask yourself a few questions. Do you believe that unregulated laissez-faire capitalism is inherently unstable? And if so, do you believe that Keynesian demand-side reforms are enough to keep the economic engine going strong? And if not, do you believe that the government desperately needs to implement a UBI program in order to address rising income inequality and increase mass consumer demand? I could tell you where I stand on that debate, but what would be the fun in that? I want you to think for yourself on this matter. It may be that within the next few years, your government here in Australia may well hold a referendum on this topic. Would you vote yes or no on UBI? This is Professor Andrew R. Timming signing out.